For 47 years, the regime in Tehran operated under a singular, unbreakable delusion that their arsenal of ballistic missiles and suicide drones could dictate the geopolitical reality of the Middle East. But heavy munitions are utterly useless when you cannot even bring your forces to bear on the one battlefield that actually matters: the global energy table. The United States has initiated a kinetic maritime chokehold in the Strait of Hormuz, methodically severing every financial artery, keeping the Iranian state alive one by one. Donald Trump didn't just dismiss Tehran's desperate back-channel compromise to reopen the strait and set the nuclear issue aside. He ignored it entirely. Now, the regime is raising a silent white flag of defeat. Their oil economy is quite literally gasping for breath right now. What we are witnessing is not a temporary diplomatic standoff or a reversible cycle of sanctions. We are watching the terminal failure of a nation-state, happening in real time, completely off guard, and without a single shot being fired. This is not another bureaucratic round of sanctions drafted in the safe confines of a Washington boardroom. Sanctions can be evaded through illicit channels. Historically, Iranian tankers would execute ship-to-ship transfers in the dead of night, switch registry flags, and simply power down their automatic identification systems, vanishing from the digital grid. But a switched-off AIS transponder is absolutely no obstacle to a squad of Marines fast roping onto your deck from a helicopter. A flag of convenience is no invisible shield against satellite tracking. What the United States has deployed is a physical kinetic blockade, a mechanism the world has not witnessed on this scale in the last 50 years. The architecture of this encirclement is absolute. According to assessments from naval intelligence, the operational gap between the two forces is practically generational. Tehran's defensive doctrine relies on obsolete, asymmetrical area denial weapons, specifically decaying Mahome contact mines and swarm boat tactics that look good on state television but possess zero survivability in modern combat. Against this, the U.S. Navy has deployed advanced variable depth sonar arrays that obliterate any blind spots in the Gulf, tracking every Iranian asset with surgical precision. They track every tanker individually, identify it, and board it if necessary. If you want to understand the raw mechanics of global power, not the sanitized versions fed to the mainstream, but the unvarnished intelligence driving these conflicts, subscribe to this channel right now. We decode the geopolitical chessboard so you don't get played by the headlines. The sheer scale of the interception is staggering. Following the seizures of the Tuska, the Tiffany, and the Majestic X, the U.S. Navy escalated its maritime interdiction operations. On April 28, 2026, the Comoros-flagged MV Blue Star III was halted directly in the Gulf of Oman. Operators from the U.S. 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit fast roped onto the vessel from helicopters, executing a meticulous sweep of the ship's manifests. Once they verified no intended stop at an Iranian port, the ship was released. But the strategic message was broadcast loud and clear across every frequency in the Middle East. Around the Strait of Hormuz and its adjacent waters, absolutely no vessel approaches the Iranian coastline without the explicit permission of the United States Navy. This is a strategic cage. In every export attempt by sea, Iran is now confronted with the absolute risk of losing its ships. The global maritime insurance syndicates, the invisible hand that actually dictates maritime trade, have comprehensively canceled all transport policies along the Hormuz line. Asian buyers, once the reliable lifeline for illicit Iranian crude, have pulled out of the supply side at once. They understand that a U.S. boarding action is no longer a hypothetical risk. It is an almost routine occurrence. Overhead, AWACS aircraft and Sentinel-2 satellites track Iran's illicit channels strategy minute by minute. Every CENTCOM announcement marks another notch in Iran's erasure from the global oil market. The immediate mathematical result of this physical blockade is devastating. Tehran's energy exports have been slashed by an astonishing 70%. To put that into perspective, $13 billion is evaporating from the regime's financial ledger every single month. Stripped of revenue and trapped in their own waters, the regime has resorted to the ultimate humiliation, using scrapped, half-rotted ghost ships as floating storage simply because they have nowhere else to put it. But a storage ship is not a solution. It is a ticking time bomb, and the countdown to a permanent, irreversible catastrophe has already begun. The stark reality of this terminal collapse is etched deeply into the data from the maritime intelligence firm Kepler. In March 2026, Iran's daily oil export stood robustly at 1.85 million barrels. Exactly 2 weeks after the United States Navy dropped the hammer, that number crashed to a microscopic 567,000 barrels. This is not a gradual economic decline. It is a systemic freefall. The countdown has effectively begun for the Tehran regime, which now holds only 12 to 22 days of unused storage capacity left. The moment that razor-thin window closes, the sheer physical limits of their infrastructure dictate that Tehran will be forced to cut another 1.5 million barrels from its daily oil production. But shutting down an oil well is not like flipping a light switch. Oil reservoirs are highly pressurized, delicate subterranean ecosystems. When you force a massive, unplanned shut-in, rock formations shift, pressure collapses, and the reservoirs permanently degrade. A significant portion of the wells that get shut in can never return to their former capacity. In the clinical terminology of petroleum engineering literature, this phenomenon is called irreversible production loss. Energy analysts estimate this permanent, unrecoverable loss at between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. Even if the U.S. blockade were miraculously lifted tomorrow, Iran's oil industry may never return to its former state. Tehran is suffering not merely a temporary revenue shock, but a permanent loss of industrial capacity. A single strategic conflict is wiping out the country's entire vision for the future of its energy sector. The regime is leaving behind on the table not just today's revenue, but tomorrow's capacity as well. This catastrophic internal bleeding is happening at the exact moment their external leverage is being neutralized by their neighbors. A bombshell that caught Iran completely off guard sent shockwaves through the global arena. As corroborated by strategic assessments aligned with the Financial Times, the United Arab Emirates recognized the blood in the water and executed a ruthless geopolitical maneuver. The UAE made a striking decision regarding OPEC, unveiling a surprising route capable of bypassing Iran's biggest leverage card, the Strait of Hormuz. This bypass is an overwhelming feat of heavy infrastructure. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, controlled entirely by the UAE, is a massive 380-kilometer steel artery that carries crude oil directly to the Gulf of Oman without ever passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Since March 2026, exports flooding through the Fujairah terminal have surged by 57%. The line is currently pumping nearly 1.9 million barrels of oil per day. By officially exiting OPEC, the UAE will be able to put an additional 1 million barrels per day onto the market, independent of any cartel quotas. Iran's entire Hormuz card strategy appears destined to collapse with this single, calculated move. While Iran cannot find a single door beyond Hormuz, the UAE is opening a major artery that bypasses Hormuz entirely. The math behind this zero-sum game is utterly brutal. The implications of this for Iran in the energy sphere are enormous. OPEC's share of global supply control has rapidly dropped from 30% to 26%. This figure is a disaster indicator for Iran because OPEC was keeping oil prices artificially high through strict production quotas. A high global price could have ensured that even the fractional trickle of Iranian oil sold on the black market, despite the blockade, still generated meaningful revenue for the regime. But the UAE's exit could trigger a massive wave of supply that drags global prices down sharply. Iran is suddenly trapped in a lethal two-front loss, simultaneously losing both its export volume due to the U.S. Navy and its per-barrel revenue due to Gulf competitors. These moves are turning Tehran's energy market into a scene of collapse within a matter of days. Every dollar bled from Iran is instantly weaponized into an estimated $150 million per day windfall for the rest of the Gulf states. The Iranian regime, blinded by its own flawed decision-making, chose to threaten the Gulf states and spread the fear of prolonged war instead of safeguarding its energy revenues. They hung themselves with their own rope, pushing Iran into perhaps its most critical bend. But the permanent death of their oil fields is only the first domino, because when the treasury violently dries up, the loyalty of a 40-year mercenary network inevitably begins to rot. For decades, Iran believed it possessed a geographic failsafe against American maritime dominance. The deep-water port of Chabahar, situated safely outside the notorious choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, was supposed to be the regime's ultimate strategic trump card. Developed over years with heavy Indian capital, Chabahar was the prized Plan B, the designated exit gateway for the highly anticipated China and Russia-backed international north-south transport corridor. Tehran viewed this terminal as its most vital geopolitical reserve, an untouchable lifeline to the Asian markets. But the physical wall of the U.S. Navy has seamlessly expanded to encircle this Plan B as well. The tankers currently stranded at Chabahar can no longer leave because the United States military is proactively halting every single Iran-linked vessel transiting the wider Gulf of Oman. The resulting maritime traffic jam is a portrait of a paralyzed nation. On a normal operational day, only 5 ships would be moored at the Chabahar terminal. Today, more than 20 massive tankers and cargo vessels sit indefinitely jammed, imprisoned at anchor, and waiting for clearance that will never come. The regime in Tehran is watching in real time as its heavily touted alternative route is reduced to a graveyard of imprisoned tankers, and they have absolutely nothing resembling a Plan C. The true geopolitical disaster, however, is not merely the stranded crude. It is the rapid, unapologetic evaporation of alliances. Nations do not operate on loyalty. They operate on calculated risk. And doing business with the Iranian state has officially transitioned from a manageable diplomatic friction into a toxic, uninsurable liability. In a brutal display of geopolitical pragmatism, India has aggressively shelved its Chabahar investment. Instead of fighting the American interdiction, New Delhi simply pivoted, signing a lucrative new contract with the UAE's Fujairah line. Iran's designated bridge to Asia is being systematically dismantled and abandoned, even by its own developmental partners. Even traditional allies are pulling back, explicitly declaring that business with Iran is simply too dangerous a risk. This represents an unprecedented, structural erosion of the Tehran regime's regional standing. This total external isolation cascades directly into the singular pillar of Iranian foreign policy, their proxy deterrence network. For 40 years, a massive, unrecorded portion of Iran's oil revenues flowed directly into the clandestine coffers of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That money was then systematically routed to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to Iraqi militias, and to the so-called resistance network operating in Syria. But ideological fervor has limits. According to strategic frameworks developed by Chatham House, proxy militias are fundamentally massive payroll operations. A soldier, a ballistic missile, a suicide drone, an entire proxy group, all of it requires a continuous stream of hard currency. And that financial artery is now entirely clogged. Money is no longer flowing into Tehran's treasury, and the downstream starvation is immediate. In Lebanon, the financial strain has reached a breaking point, bringing Hezbollah to the humiliating position of being unable to pay basic salaries to its operatives. In the volatile Red Sea theater, the Houthis in Yemen are actively burning through their last remaining stockpile of offensive drones, with no resupply in sight. In Iraq, deeply entrenched Shia militias are physically pulling back from the battlefield because the expected funding has simply failed to arrive. The Iranian regime is on the verge of losing, within just a few agonizing weeks, the vast proxy war network it spent 4 decades painstakingly building. The Revolutionary Guards had spent years projecting an aura of invincibility, constantly declaring that if Iran perceived a threat, their regional response would be merciless. But the United States Navy silenced that threat with a single, bloodless logistical move that decisively cut off the IRGC's cash flow. This silent financial collapse is actively dismantling Iran's military deterrence piece by piece. Tehran earned its regional weight solely by heavily investing in this proxy network, And now that exact channel of investment is completely drying up. The irony is absolute. The regime actively chose to prioritize the prominent figures of the IRGC and its foreign proxy network over the economic welfare of its own citizens. With today's emerging picture of economic catastrophe and the total cutoff of energy exports, Tehran is entering a process from which return is nearly impossible. The billions of dollars they are hemorrhaging are being seamlessly absorbed by their Gulf competitors, funding a new era of Arab dominance while Iran suffocates. But the failure of their foreign policy is just the catalyst, because when a heavily militarized regime runs out of money to pay its external mercenaries, the fire inevitably turns inward. For 47 years, the Iranian regime weaponized a highly specific psychological armor, the myth of the resistance economy. This was the foundational propaganda dictating that the Islamic Republic was an impenetrable fortress system, uniquely immune to Western pressure. They boasted that despite decades of U.S. embargoes, European sanctions, and UN resolutions, they had never collapsed. But financial sanctions are a legal fiction. A kinetic naval blockade is a physical, undeniable reality. And that reality has thoroughly shattered the regime's foundational myth in a matter of weeks. The true depth of this institutional panic is not visible in public broadcasts, but in the highly classified corridors of the state. On April 27, 2026, an explosive exclusive report by Iran International leaked the minutes of an emergency session of the Supreme National Security Council, chaired by Mohammad Bakr Zulfikar. The document reads less like a strategic assessment and more like a formal declaration of surrender. The security apparatus reached three devastating conclusions. First, crippling economic pressure dictates that anti-regime protests could break out again within days. Second, the absolute mathematical limit the regime can withstand this U.S. blockade is 6 to 8 weeks. Third, by the end of the spring season, nearly 2 million jobs will be entirely eradicated in the private sector. Security officials summarize the nation's trajectory in one chilling, definitive sentence. Unrest is inevitable, only its timing is uncertain. They are putting it in writing that their heavily guarded fortress economy has a lifespan of less than 2 months. This massive internal hemorrhage is now bleeding visibly onto the streets. The most humiliating admission of defeat came directly from the highest civilian office. On April 25, 2026, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian addressed the nation on state television. He did not offer defiant rhetoric or promises of military retaliation. Instead, in a crushing blow to the regime's projected strength, Pezeshkian openly begged the public to drastically reduce their electricity consumption, advising them to turn on only 2 lamps in their homes instead of 10. The president of a nation that claims to command the Middle East is begging his citizens to sit in the dark. He has no other cards left to play. The state infrastructure is rapidly shutting down. Government offices are now operating on half-day schedules. Heating inside the Tehran metro system is being constantly cut to save energy. In major industrial and cultural hubs like Isfahan and Tabriz, streetlights have been arbitrarily reduced by half, plunging the cities into darkness. The macroeconomic indicators are apocalyptic. Over the past 2 months, the Iranian rial has violently plunged to 1.8 million against the US dollar. Annual inflation has shattered the 40% mark. Citizens are standing in growing lines for basic survival staples like bread, meat, and milk, while the cost of imported medicines has skyrocketed by nearly 60%. The unspoken social contract, where the regime bought domestic compliance through heavy subsidies, is completely unraveling. Even the highest levels of the American financial warfare apparatus recognize the terminal velocity of this crisis. On April 27, 2026, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent delivered a historic and chilling assessment, stating that Iran's physical oil pumping capacity is on the verge of a total collapse. It was Bessent who accurately prophesied the staggering geopolitical paradox we are now seeing. A top-tier petroleum-producing nation forcing its own citizens to line up for rationed gasoline. Despite these heavy clouds gathering over the state, the hardliners remain rigidly paralyzed. The IRGC absolutely refuses to open its enriched uranium facilities to international inspection. The singular, narrow exit ramp for Tehran would be to approve unlimited, immediate, and highly intrusive access for the International Atomic Energy Agency to every nuclear site in the country. But the civilian government is operating under such overwhelming military pressure from the Revolutionary Guards that they cannot even place this survival option on the negotiating table. The regime is trapped inside its own ideological cage. They cannot sell their oil, they cannot fund their mercenaries, they cannot feed their people, and they refuse to trade their nuclear ambitions for survival. The 6 to 8 week death spiral is rapidly accelerating, which leaves Tehran staring down the barrel of an impossible, existential choice. As the blockade strangulates the final arteries of the Iranian state, the geopolitical chessboard has been reduced to 3 terminal scenarios. In the first scenario, the regime capitulates entirely, bringing its highly guarded nuclear program to the negotiating table. Donald Trump signs a comprehensive maximalist agreement in exchange for lifting the naval blockade. However, this path requires a level of domestic submission that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps would likely interpret as outright treason, risking a violent institutional fracture. In the second scenario, the regime attempts to blindly resist while the U.S. blockade holds firm. The 6 to 8 week window violently closes, the economy collapses, and the mass protests forecasted by their own Security Council erupt into nationwide unrest. The regime would be forced to execute a brutal, uncompromising crackdown on its own starving citizens, mirroring the heavy bloodshed of the January protests. The third scenario is the kinetic endgame. The United States decides not to wait for an internal collapse and authorizes a direct military strike. CENTCOM activates its prepared, forceful operational plans, launching overwhelming strikes to instantly obliterate Iran's nuclear infrastructure and heavily fortified Revolutionary Guard bases. If this kinetic option is triggered, Tehran faces a rapid, catastrophic military defeat. For those of you listening on Spotify to make those long drives more enjoyable, we appreciate you choosing us as your definitive source for global intelligence. We have laid out the raw intelligence. Now, we require your analytical assessment. Between total nuclear capitulation, bloody internal collapse, or a kinetic CENTCOM decapitation strike, which of these 3 terminal scenarios do you assess as the most probable endgame for Tehran? Lock in your strategic forecasts in the comments below.